tonight. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. I think it's very apposite time to be talking about the good people of fairies and witches and curses, you know, given that we're approaching Halloween and it's a full moon outside. Hopefully you've got a view of that where you are. I'll begin by sharing my presentation. I've got what I hope will be some interesting, some nice images for you tonight, and then I'll get going. Okay. Right, here we go. Now, the first thing I want to say is to recount an anecdote that I heard a few years ago. I was teaching a class about the history of witchcraft, an adult education class in a library, and sort of community education class. And one of the people that came along to that, one of the chaps, told me that magic had saved his life. He didn't mean supernaturally. He didn't mean that he'd been healed by a spell or protected by an amulet or cured by a charm. He meant psychologically. He was alluding to the soothing, the inspiring, the comforting power of faith, belief, and imagination. Unfortunately, though, not all experiences of magic in the modern world and in the contemporary world are like that. They don't all illustrate the kind of some of the positive consequences that magical thinking, magical beliefs can have. Another one of my students, for example, was brave enough to share with us that when she was a young woman, she's a very intelligent woman, she's a journalist now, very, very successful. When she was a young woman, when she was 18, something absolutely appalling happened to her. She lost both her parents. And she went to a fortune teller. You can imagine just head spinning just to try and understand what was happening. And this fortune teller told her and convinced her that her parents had died as a result of a curse that had been laid on the family and that was still active, and that the only way to remove it would be through a great deal of work and, of course, a great deal of expense. So they're two quite extreme anecdotes, but they illustrate the incredible power of magic. And I don't mean supernaturally. I'm not going to tell you whether magic or supernatural powers exist or not tonight. I don't think that's something that a historian can do. In my view, that's a metaphysical and a personal question. But I would like to talk about some of the uses of magic, some of the uses and abuses, like I talked about, some of the ways that magic can be consoling, the ways that it can be funny, it can be disturbing, it can be annoying, and that it can be terrifying. I think it's an important thing to do when we're looking at magic in the modern world, because it's a subject that's far too easily trivialized, seen as a kind of an exotic and colourful hangover from the past that doesn't really have a substantial impact on people's lives. But I want to argue against that tonight by looking at the evidence from 19th century Britain and Ireland particularly, but also taking that history right up to the present day. Now, I don't want to sort of have a long digression discussing various different academic approaches to the study of magic. There is an academic approach known as functionalism, which is a kind of really single-minded consideration of the uses and the functions and the abuses of magic. I do think there's more to magic than that. That one single approach doesn't comprehend it all. Nevertheless, as I said, I still think this is really a helpful way to think about it, to underline the persistent power of magic in the modern world, to really to change people's lives, to challenge people, to move people, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. And I'd like to begin by talking about cursing. Not cursing in the sense of ordinary four-letter words and swearing, cursing in the sense of maledictions. Now, historically, and this was particularly the case in Ireland, where there was a really well-developed and well-known, a really artful culture of cursing. Historically, cursing was distinguished from witchcraft. Now, witchcraft was generally understood as harmful magic, as afflicting somebody with bad luck, with ill health, with accidents and what have you. It's the sort of thing that, you could glean from this following image here. This is this is an onion with a name, right? It's a very special onion. It's called Tyler's onion. So you're doing well if you get an onion named after you. It's a piece of effigy magic, actually, that was discovered by an anthropologist in the late 19th century in Somerset. He was having a drink in a pub in Somerset, and there was a windy day, and all of a sudden all these onions came tumbling out the window, these things with pins in, and everyone, the other people in the room were a bit kind of perturbed by that, a bit disturbed by that. And what he eventually discovered was that the landlord of the pub was was not a particularly nice chap, and had got it in for some of his neighbours, and was trying to do something quite ghastly. You can look at that there, you can kind of infer up from being drying it out up the chimney, stabbing it with pins. He was kind of so that's witchcraft, that at least in the historical sense. Today witchcraft's much more diverse and means many more things, but if we're going back to the 19th century and before, it was typically understood as harmful magic. Cursing was different, though. Cursing was it's like a sort of harmful form of supernatural power, but it had a built-in morality to it. The idea was that curses only afflicted people, they only fell on people, they only landed on people if those people were guilty of misdeeds and of crimes. On the other hand, if they were innocent, the curse would miss, and it'd go swirling around in the ether, and it might well come back on the person who'd so immorally and wrongly tried to curse an innocent person. So here's a really incredible image of cursing from 19th century Ireland. Some of you, perhaps all of you, will know this artist, Daniel McDonald, who was really quite a visionary young man. He unfortunately died in his early 30s, didn't have a very long career, but in the early and mid 19th century, he painted some really important sort of vernacular scenes, I guess, of life in Ireland. And here, well, take a look at this. I'm sure you can all kind of work out what's going on here. This is the eviction in the midst of the famine. They're the bailiffs on the right. They're kicking out the family. Kicking out the family in this appalling time of starvation, pestilence, and desperation. And in that desperate moment, we've got someone, I don't know if it's the grandmother maybe here. She's down on her knees. She's beseeching the Almighty, as people did, to lay a curse on the landlord who's evicted this family here. Now you might think, what did this actually achieve? People were cursing like this. Well, the answer is actually quite a lot. There are documented cases of people who tried to buy, they call them distressed farms, like farms where sort of had a sitting tenant who wasn't paying the rent, that kind of thing. And there's a case even as late as 1901 from County Sligo of there's a Scottish guy wanted to buy a farm, and the tenant said, "All right then, but I'm gonna lay the widow's curse on you," and he actually pulled out of the sale after he'd already sort of advanced it somewhat. It's not just an anecdote; it actually happened. It went to court, and he had to explain to the court that I want to get out of this farm that I so rashly bid on. And in fact, across a whole range of conflicts in 19th century Ireland, curses were there at the sharp end. Curses were there as a form, perhaps, of catharsis, for people who were, in desperate straits, who had no other alternative, who had nothing else that they could do. It's like a kind of epic form of the ordinary swearing, kind of letting it all out, letting all your sort of bitterness and anger out. But they were also there, curses, in conflicts over religion, in attempts. There were quite a few attempts to. There was a movement in mid-19th century Ireland to try and spread Protestantism across the whole of Ireland, and there was the sort of fight backs from some Catholic priests who would curse their parishioners or their former parishioners, former flocks who would convert to Protestantism. So there are all sorts of various examples like this. Cursing was so powerful, it was so intimidating in Ireland because it was very, very artful. It was done with real poise, with real, real sort of lyrical ability. You could lay curses, they're just basic curses that people used, and often they used them for jokes and just for a bit of a laugh, like something like "bad luck to you," for example, or like kind of quite a limited curse, and those kind of things were They were usually used metaphorically. They were quite, because you could quite easily reverse them. You know, if you said that's somebody said bad luck to you, so they might reply, well, bad luck to you then, or good luck to you then, but may neither of them ever happen. You know, and the idea was that in this very lyrical form of magic, that it was almost like a verbal battle, and the curse could be sent back. Well, if you're a really prolific curser, probably like this lady here, and people who were in terribly desperate straits, you had to come up with the kind of words that were absolutely chilling, the kind of words that made people stop, made them think, you know, stop them from hitting back. Some of these curses were constructed from, you know, quite complex wordplay, like stuff like, may you never die till you see your own funeral. And I don't know if anybody knows what that's alluding to. That was the idea that that was saying basically, may you be hanged. You know, you see your own funeral if you're on the gallows and, you know, kind of looking out at the people watching you. It's really chilling stuff. So people would pile these curses on top of each other, you know, really powerful and kind of very specific wordplay, you know, like about stomachs being churned up and arms being pulled off and eyes being withered, you know, really horrible stuff. And then, like this lady here on this image, it done with a certain amount of ritual as well, and a certain amount of theatre. So, you know, get down on your knees, maybe let your hair down, beseeching the Almighty. Perhaps there were cases, even cases from the mid-20th century, of people falling out over inheritances, this sort of thing, getting down on their knees, holding up crucifixes, absolutely chilling stuff. And to try and underline how these forms of magic can be really powerful and really quite intimidating, I want to just sort of move on to very briefly the medical literature just here. Let me just move on to the next slide. So magic is powerful, as I've written here. There's quite a large body now of medical literature that explores how belief in magic and fears that, you know, one's being attacked magically or cursed magically, how they can have real effects on your body. The guy here on the left, this might look like quite a sinister figure. He's actually an American physician called Walter Cannon, and he wrote a really a kind of key article in this field called Voodoo Death. Now, the title's a bit dodgy. We wouldn't use the term voodoo death nowadays because you know voodoo's a very complex thing. It's not just harmful magic. It's mostly a religion. I won't digress to talk about that. There are lots of different varieties of voodoo, but the point was that he made was basically right. Even though he was doing his research at a time when hormones and the endocrine system weren't very well understood, basically his thesis has been borne out by subsequent research and scholarship. And what happens, to boil it down, is that if you really get attacked magically and you really believe in it, then you can end up having like an adrenaline surge, and these hormones are pumping throughout your body, you know, getting your heart really going, and it can actually do physical damage to people. It can damage heart rhythm, damage some of your organs and what have you. So it's something very real, and it's you know, as I say, whether or not you believe in the supernatural or not, magic is an incredibly powerful psychological force. And that was particularly the case in Ireland, where people were very artful at cursing. Now, I'd like to move on though from curses now to talk about how other forms of magic were really potent and had a really wide range of uses in Ireland, not just as catharsis or intimidating people, but all sorts of other things besides. And the next topic I want to move on to is the good people. That is to say, the fairies. Now, the oldest fairy story of all is the one about the fairies belonging to the past. The oldest fairy story of all is the one about an eerie echo. Is the one about the fairies belonging to the past. Chaucer in England, in some of his writings, he kind of articulated this idea that the fairies were long gone even in the 14th century. Throughout the early modern period, which is kind of awkward term historians use to refer to sort of roughly the 1500s to the 1700s, European writers continued to recycle this idea that, you know, fairies are long gone. They're what people believed a long time ago, and we live now in a somewhat demystified world. And you can see that here just from this slide. This is a little history of the fairies that came out. It's translated from French in the early 1700s. The monarchy of the fairies once was great as good old wives and nurses do relate. Then was the golden age, from whence did spring a race of fairies dancing round a ring. So this is like a persistent idea that fairies belong in the past, but in reality they don't. This idea continued to be circulated in 19th century Ireland. You had lots of commentators, whether antiquarians, folklorists, poets, journalists, or social investigators, the kind of people that went out and about mapping Ireland for the Ordnance Survey project, incomplete one, unfortunately, but still an epic body of sources in the 1830s. And although many people thought and many people said that the fairies belonged to the past, that really wasn't the case in 19th century Ireland at all. There were, of course, oral fairy tales about changelings and about fairy blasts and about leprechauns and, you know, this sort of thing, you know, a kind of dark side of fairies with some lighter and beneficial bits. There were stage shows, stage magic, you know, the kind of people that go traveling around the place doing sort of itinerant shows, mesmerists and this kind of thing. They try to get people to see fairies. So fairies were kind of really there in the culture of well, there's some serious curses coming in the chat just here, I should say. Bless you all. You know, we don't mean them, but yeah, it's powerful stuff. It's incredible stuff. Fairies were there in the language of people in 19th century Ireland. You know, you'd use phrases like I don't know, fairy money. Fairy money was money that was, you know, going to disappear, or it wasn't real. You know, fairy fantasies was something unreal. Fairy form was a kind of like a sleazy term that men use for women. But it wasn't all just jokes. Some of the fairy phrases were really serious and really kind of quite troubling, like back gone, for example. Back gone. The primary meaning of back gone was to refer to somebody that had been either usually taken by the fairies, you know, like a changeling, or maybe blasted by the fairies and was kind of afflicted by them in some way. But this term was also used for children who were abused, you know, sort of domestic violence. And it was kind of connected with some of the social and economic tensions and conflicts in Ireland as well. Back gone, rent was rent that you were never going to collect. Paula adds here, housing developments in the 20th century built around fairy forts and fairy trees. Yes, absolutely. I mean, they're still important today. There's still something like 40,000 of them. There's fairy thorns, fairy forts, in Ireland today. And although some of them were built over in the 19th century, many weren't. And you know, that's sort of, it's testament to the power of these ideas. And you know, you have to start wondering, like, you know, what's the use of that? You know, and in some cases, I think these stories about fairy forts and what have you, it you know, kind of expressed misgivings people had about, I don't know, building kind of. There were some churches that people, you know, that kept falling down. People said it was because of the fairies, and in the background you can kind of detect that there's a bit of animosity to the way that the land was being used. So it's a way of kind of protecting the land, or sort of asserting control over land in some way. You know, it's kind of a kind of use in fairies in that way. There's lots of fairy art in the 19th century as well. Here's a sort of quite traditional picture of the good people from the work of one of the great fairy story collectors, Thomas Crofton Croker. You see, you've got a little chap there. He's been discovered. He's doing what I would do if I was one of the fairies, going down in the cellar and, you know, having a drink and that kind of thing. I don't want to advertise my vices too widely there. Rachel adds here, lots of fairy thorns we have here as well. Yes, fairy thorn in the middle of Belfast, adds Marianne. Absolutely. I mean, in a lot of the commentary on 19th century Ireland, there was this idea that, you know, fairy belief, it was principally a Catholic thing, and it was principally a thing sort of down in the south, maybe in the southwest. But actually, you can find it across the country, even in the urban environments. Even in Belfast, there was treasure hunting, for example, that was supposed to be done with aid of the fairies. There were cases of this in mid 19th century Belfast, for example. So there's lots of wonderful, you know, there's lots of talk of the fairies, lots of stories in the fairies in the 19th century. Use of them metaphorically, like just here, you can see this is a picture by an English artist in the that came out towards the start of the Great Famine, and it was using the idea of fairy stricken to try and raise the consciousness of English readers really to the apocalypse that was going on over the water. And then more literal depictions as well, like this one again from Daniel McDonald. This is the calls it the fairy blast or the fairy wind. It was this idea that fairies travelled at certain times of the year, particularly in the form of a whirlwind. And this, you can see here, there's a sort of whirlwind on this painting, lots of grim-faced and quite troubled travellers here. And stuff like this, you know, it can happen in real life as well, in the sense that I can remember reading the account of a scientist who was trying to study land spouts. You know, land spouts are like a tornado, it's like sort of water on the land, and he was going out and he was chasing one through a certain district, and he was asking the local farmers and the peasants and so on for information about it, and they just wouldn't say, because they thought that, you know, it was the fairies, and the fairies probably wouldn't like what I'm doing tonight, which is speaking very frankly about them. It was one of the rules, of course, if you wanted to move on from using the fairies just in conversation and in metaphor to actually kind of low-level fairy belief, there were certain taboos that needed to be observed. Just as jinn in Islamic societies today are often given euphemistic names and not called jinn, they're called like the generous, something like that. Just as in ancient Greece, the gods of vengeance that we often call today the Furies, they were known as the kindly ones. Well, in Ireland, the fairies were referred to euphemistically as well, as, you know, as the good people and what have you. That's why it could be quite shocking when people broke these taboos. Let me just have a look at the chat here. Mariana's explaining where the fairy thorn is in Belfast. That's fascinating. Going to come over soon, and I'll have a look at that. On Sandy Row, Julia Phillips adds, when I was a child in rural West Island in the 1950s, a local farmer told me an amazing story about the fairies travelling home after their party when the hay was being brought in. Yes, it's amazing the sort of vitality of these themes and these stories. So I was talking about fairy talk. When people broke these conventions, you know, it could become quite a national scandal, and one of those, or quite a national story anyway. Scandal's a bit too much. It happened in 1904 down in County Tipperary. One of the local councillors said, you know, curse the fairies, you know, fairies be cursed, you know, something really shocking like that. And he said it because this cottage here had just been rented out. This cottage was the location where a really poor woman, a really unfortunate woman, horribly abused woman called Bridget Cleary was killed by her husband, and in the presence of her family, she was you know, sort of labelled as a changeling and burned, and the house remained unoccupied for another 9 years until these events. So you go from there's lots of fairy imagery and metaphor, and then there's this kind of low-level belief that manifests itself in taboos and what have you. And it's also it was also expressed through various rituals, defensive rituals, basically designed to protect yourself from and not to offend the fairies. So, for instance, people would, you know, you could carve. Children were thought to be particularly vulnerable, so maybe you carve crosses into the feet of a crib where you kept your little baby, or you might paint a cross on a wall near your land like this, or lay one into the mortar. If you can just see it here, this is from the early 20th century in County Kerry like this. Or alternatively, you could leave out offerings, a little bit of potatoes, bit of milk, butter, even some whiskey in some cases. So you might be thinking, how does this relate to the uses of magic that I was talking about at the start? Well, psychologists have made quite a study of what is pejoratively known as superstition. I'm not sure I'm completely happy with that word, but you know, luck and you know, sort of lucky amulets and lucky necklace, lucky pants, that kind of stuff. And it turns out that these kind of superstitions seem to be particularly observed by people that are take part in risky occupations. So it's, you know, fishermen, for example, or fisher folk, people in financial services, would you believe, you know, you imagine the markets going up and down, you don't kind of know where they're going, people taking exams, and, you know, sort of and in sports as well, professional professional sports people are particularly notable for having their own little rites and rituals. And you can kind of link this really with some of the low-level fairy belief and low-level fairy practices in 19th, early 20th century Ireland. You can kind of imagine, I don't think it's pushing it too far, that people living, hard lives, really hard lives, obviously, compared to what we enjoy now, and kind of precarious lives. You didn't really know how the crops were going to turn out, that kind of thing. Maybe in a strange way, doing these rituals gave you a bit of feeling of control and a kind of feeling of comfort there. Now, if you wanted to take it up, if you wanted to go from fairy metaphors and figurative use of fairies to low-level belief to a kind of higher-level fairy belief, that's when you needed to start calling in the professionals. And people, a lot of people kind of did those rites I was talking about, kind of half believing in a way. They sort of profess skepticism, but they do it just in case, just so what's the harm after all, and not very much. But more a fuller belief in the fairies, a really sincere, really pronounced and really powerful, it tended to be something that people adopted only temporarily when disasters happened in their lives that they couldn't solve in ordinary ways, and they'd run out of the conventional solutions. So you imagine that people are ill, they would go to the doctors, they'd go to the dispensary, they'd take their medicines, they'd use some of the medical treatments that had worked from the time, and a lot of the ones that wouldn't, horrid stuff like bleeding people. But if these things didn't work, and if it looked like somebody was really mysteriously ill, or maybe they were on the way out or something like that, that's when people started to use different mindsets and kind of throw themselves into magical ways of thinking. Yes, Teresa's mentioned melancholy madness here, which is absolutely has got a reference to infants born as changelings. Yes, there needs to be a much wider look into the records of coroners, I think, in 19th century Ireland to try and identify more of these cases. Yes, yes, I've noticed that reference as well. And so you got these problems, maybe animals, or more likely people that were really desperately ill. Then you could go and see a professional magician. They're sometimes known as wizards, sometimes known as cunning folk, but most often in Ireland they were known as fairy doctors. And they were people who you went to when you tried everything else and you were absolutely desperate, like this woman here. There were people who sometimes they said they got their powers from the fairies, that they'd been away, they knew them, they'd spent time with the good people. They often dressed in quite a kind of striking way. They're trying to kind of construct an aura that could make people think that they're at the same time strange, but kind of believe in them. Or they speak in a kind of weird and mystical patter. You might think that these people were just the propagators of a really sort of antique and outdated way of thinking and practicing, but actually there are new ideas coming into the new techniques coming into the practice of magic in this period. For example, in America in 1848, there was the emergence of a new movement known as spiritualism, which is a type of spirit communication done through, spirit rapping and turning tables and all this sort of stuff. Well, that made its way over the Atlantic in the early 1950s, and a few fairy doctors began to adopt some of those practices within their more and combine them with their more traditional methods. So these fairy doctors were where people went to when they were in desperate straits. Maybe they had sort of mental illness, for example, that just couldn't be treated at the time, couldn't be treated effectively. And you might think that their Teresa asked, did religion have any sway and protection from the wrath of fairies? Yes, an enormous amount. Just saying the name of God, or saying bless you, or mentioning the saints, that kind of thing, that was supposed to protect you. Having a baptism, that was supposed to provide you with a form of protection. People had rosary beads, sleeping with a Bible under your pillow. Yes, there was an enormous amount of protection that was provided from religion as well. But with the fairy doctors, although they were called quacks at the time, their work was technically illegal and they were kind of denounced. And some of the stuff they did was extremely dodgy. But at the time, there were also professional doctors, qualified physicians who recognized the kind of, the power of faith, not just to disturb people, to wind people up, to frighten them, like I was talking about with cursing, but also the power of faith and belief to help some people sometimes, like a placebo effect, really. In the study of the placebo effect nowadays, in fact, there's some scholars write about the enhanced placebo effect. And this is the idea that, you get a small placebo effect if you give someone a pill and you say it's a magic pill and it's just a sugar pill. But if you put somebody in a machine with flashing lights and lots of stuff whizzing around, it has much more powerful, it activates the body's self-healing functions much more powerfully. And with their talent for ritual and kind of persona and storytelling and that sort of thing, fairy doctors, they could really cultivate temporarily a really powerful belief in them, in their clients. And you can kind of imagine that would help people, some people, some of the time. And there's an example I was looking at earlier on, for instance, from is a guy called he called himself Dr. O'Toole. He wasn't a qualified doctor, but when you're a fairy doctor, you have to give yourself a good title. And he was based on the border between County Kilkenny and County Laois in the early 19th century, lived up till about the 1850s. And some of the local doctors had to give him credit for his ability to help people feel better, particularly if they were suffering from nervous ailments. Let me check the chat just here. Yes, there'll be time for questions at the end. Absolutely, yes. So I'll proceed with my talk a little bit further. Now, there's analogous developments like this going on in analogous arrangements in Britain at the same time. The belief in fairies, on the whole, wasn't as widespread as in Britain. You could still find it, and particularly in Highland Scotland, in Wales, maybe in Cornwall, and some other bits of the West Country, elsewhere too. But it wasn't as pronounced in Britain. It was more when people were trying to explain the inexplicable and kind of look for answers when they couldn't solve them with normal remedies. They instead, in Britain, people would start thinking in terms of witchcraft. They'd say they were bewitched rather than smote or attacked by the fairies. And here we've got it's in a gallery in Cornwall now. We've got a painting from the late 19th century of a fortune teller there. I think this painting actually tells you quite a lot about the approach of and the ability of many of these healers, that you can see the clients just sat on the windowsill there looking down at the cards, but the very savvy fortune teller, she's doing what she needs to do. She's looking straight at the clients and kind of doing some reading of her body language and what have you here. Now, so there's some useful consequences of believing in magic and behaving in magic, but they're also, really very abusive and very scary aspects to it as well. And those are associated particularly with a case I'm sure many of you will know, which I mentioned earlier on, which is the killing of this poor lady, you can see on the left here, Bridget Cleary, by her husband, Michael Cleary. And that case fits some of the patterns I was talking about earlier on, where, they've been going to they've called the priest in, they've been going to the doctor, and it was when all those things had failed that they called in the fairy doctor and they started calling Bridget a fairy and what have you. I've been looking through the newspaper records in Ireland, so trying to find similar cases of this, and I'm sorry to say that Bridget Cleary wasn't a singular figure in 19th century Ireland. There are at least 13 other people that were killed after being labelled changelings or fairies, and either burned, beaten, drowned, or poisoned with concoctions made of foxglove. Foxglove, it's called lusmore in Ireland at the time. I can't remember the proper name of it. I'm sure many of you would know. So there are 13 cases, and in fact, it wasn't even the case, as is sometimes said, that Bridget Cleary was the only adult to be killed as a changeling in 19th century Ireland. In fact, I'm sorry to say, there were 4 more people who shared her fate. There was a woman from Galway in 1920 who got burnt and beaten to death, being accused of being a fairy. There was another one from County Cork by her husband, again in 1831. A further case in 1834 from County Kilkenny. This time it was the fairy doctor that actually killed the poor lady. Fairy doctors, sometimes not all their cures were sort of herbal and charms and this kind of thing. They actually prescribed violence. There was this, and you can find this really disturbing and unsettling belief quite widely, actually, beyond Ireland, beyond even Britain, the belief in the purifying power of pain, the exercising power of pain. And it wasn't all, and in most cases, it was sort of husbands that killed their wives, as so you can imagine that these kind of beliefs were kind of cover or for domestic abuse, basically, and it kind of incorporated aspects of domestic abuse, but not in all cases. There was a case in 1837, for example, from Limerick of a woman that was killed by her daughter-in-law. So these are some of the uses and abuses of magic in the 19th century. Still, although officially and in sort of mainstream culture, orthodox culture, magic was demeaned, it was laughed at, it was mocked, it still had incredible psychological power to move people to do the most appalling things, and also to help people trying to survive in the most desperate circumstances as well. Now, the question is, one of the primary questions is, what made this kind of this culture come to an end, these practices, some of them quite disturbing. What made it diminish anyway? I mean, obviously you'll still find a good deal of fairy lore and fairy belief in Ireland nowadays, and I think partly that can be explained by looking at how people's lives were changing, that the world was becoming a little bit less dangerous. Starvation was not quite as close at the door. There were slight advances in medicine and so on. But I think in Ireland and in Britain, I think one of the key developments is that the growth of law and order, the growth of professional policing, that started to really crack down on kind of magical violence and on also on fairy doctors and cunning folk in the mainland. So you got sort of situations like this. This is some British newspapers from the late 19th century here. Fortune tellers in trouble. As I said, this line of work had always been illegal and had been sort of sporadically prosecuted, but there were a growing number of prosecutions against these magical practitioners in the late 19th century. And I think that really kind of dealt a blow. It didn't destroy it, but it dealt a blow to these ways of magical thinking, because fairy doctors, the professional magicians and cunning folk in Britain, they've been instrumental in spreading these ideas, in teaching people about what it was to believe in witches and believe in fairies and what have you. Another theme I think that would really deserve, I'm sorry I haven't really pursued this line of inquiry very much yet, that would really be worth pursuing in Ireland, is to look at the growth of child protection as well from the late 19th century, because as I said earlier on, unfortunately you get these harrowing cases against adults in the early 19th century. With the growth of policing, they seem to drop off later, but there's still there's over a dozen cases of poor children being killed in the 19th century, and then many, many, many more cases. It's just the tip of the iceberg of people being harmed and dumped in rivers, left out on the dung heap, that kind of thing. And I think the NSPCC, the National Society for the Protection of Children, that was founded in the 1890s, and kind of had a branch in Ireland. And I think these kind of developments are important here, and it actually underlines the importance of certain regulations in it. You'll tell from what I've said already, I don't think all magical beliefs and all magical practices are bad, but some definitely are. And it's a way of thinking that can sometimes get really extreme and really quite dangerous. And I think this history suggests, at least in my view, that the state and regulation can play a role in sort of cracking down and limiting the more harmful sides of magical belief. Now, of course, belief in fairies and belief in witches and belief in curses and what have you, it didn't completely disappear, although it declined in the 20th century, in the late 19th century. And we could, of course, still find examples of it today. Here's a few just to illustrate. We've heard already some of the people in the comments that spoke about the survival of fairy forts and fairy bushes, and how these can even do things like you can say here. This is a case from the 1990s. Redirect a road for a fairy bush, or a more recent example, the Healy Ray family are. I guess you could call them like sort of unorthodox politicians, maybe populists, perhaps. I'm sure some people on the call will have a better term for, a more apt term for them. But these are people that have kind of used magic politically again. So you saw in the 19th century in Ireland a great deal of political magic. As I said, curses were used to kind of in trying to oppose evictions and in election campaigns even, and what have you. And the fairies even had a political dimension in the 19th century as well. They were used as cover from when people were going out and having armed drills, in preparation for sort of uprisings or for raw violence and what have you. And I think it's interesting. We could smile at these things, like these developments, like the fairies being mentioned by politicians and coming back into political life. But I think, or I worry that it's a sign that, we're living in more disordered times again. It's just hints of it, but, fairies coming back into politics. There's sort of examples like from the 19th century where this is from the Isle of Skye here in the Hebrides. The fairies apparently wrote to the planning officers on the Hebrides to oppose the building of a salmon farm in 2020. So as we start to have growing discontent, I guess, and disenchantment with political orthodoxy, concerns about land use and about ecological degradation, you can see that magic's kind of coming back slightly, not anything like as much in the 19th century, but it's coming back to the fore. It's coming back into public life, and it's a sign, I think, that things are unsettled, and that people are looking for solutions that that they're not able to get in the normal way of things. A more extreme example would come from America, for instance. Now, some of you might have, if you follow American politics, you might know that there was some of the attempts to unseat Donald Trump and ensure he didn't get re-elected were actually magical. Let me show you this here. There was a big movement. It really got loads of media coverage in the United States to cast a collective spell on Donald Trump by progressive, left-wing occultists in the United States. It's called the Bind Trump movement. And as I say, you can laugh at this stuff, and it was supposed to be kind of a little, have an element of humor in it, but I do think it's a distinctive development. It's something that hasn't happened for quite some time for magic to come back into contestations over, as I say, over ecology, over land use, and over politics as well. I hope you'll forgive me, just give a little aside here. The guy that organised this Bind Trump spell, he actually circulated one of my articles about Irish cursing and about the artful ways that Irish people historically went about cursing. Sort of to kind of inform these magical attempts to unseat Donald Trump. So the academics among you will know and may shudder when you hear the term impact. How does your research have impact? Well, I can say that, maybe my paper helped to magically unseat Donald Trump. I don't know. So to conclude, I think it's a really important dimension of the study of magic to look at the different functions and the different uses. These are really broad and extensive and diverse, and unfortunately I haven't touched on them all tonight. Magic can be consoling, it can be inspiring, it can be funny, it can be amusing, but it can also be challenging, it can be disturbing. And I think we need to take more account of that, and if we do, we'll start to see how serious magic is in the modern day and what a force it is during the modern period. So I've spoken for about 45 minutes now, and I'm very happy to speak longer, but I don't want to try your patience. So for now, I'll just shamelessly say that if you'd like to read more about the history of Irish cursing, do look this article up. It's free, it's online, you don't have to pay anything. And if you'd like to read about the history of witchcraft in modern Britain over the last 200 years, about the kind of the ways that people ended up thinking and believing and concluding they were bewitched and what they did about it, you can also look at my book, which you can see here. It's Cursed Britain, a very apposite title now. A history of witchcraft and black magic in modern times. So there's so much of the topic that I haven't spoken about and haven't touched on. So I'm very happy to answer questions if you wish. But for now, I'll say thank you indeed, everybody.